Hello, so this recording is obviously going to focus on writing your methodology. Now, I always like to describe a methodology as like your cooking recipe. So basically, it takes you back to doing maybe science at school when you tried to explain how you did an experiment, and it's very similar here. And it's much the same as actually trying to explain something, how you cooked something. So how did you collect and analyse your data? That's essentially what you're trying to tell people. So you need to tell people what you did, how you did it, and importantly, particularly for good grades, is why it was appropriate to do this in relation to your topic. So, why were you using interviews? What was the point of using discourse analysis? You need to kind of explain those details and actually link them back to your topic. Why did your topic warrant that particular approach being adopted? So, you need to justify your decisions, and I suggest you use the textbooks recommended. For this, you don't have to go and look at other things that are, more dense or complicated. Just go and use the textbooks that I've suggested you go and look at, and they will be the most helpful thing you can use to justify your decisions. Other things you can use is you can use journal articles from related studies. So, for instance, I've got an example there that Jones, 2017, also used questionnaires to explore motivations to attend cultural events. So that could be part of your justification for adopting questionnaires in a study on motivations to attend cultural events. That's great. What you shouldn't do, and what I often see students doing, is they've kind of go, I've got to justify using a questionnaire. Random Googling. In this nursing project, they used a questionnaire. And somehow they make some sort of link with that, and so they're referencing a nursing report. Questionnaires are good at quantifying impacts. Nursing today, and I'm kind of thinking, that's not very close to your topic area. So it shows actually when a student hasn't been really researching their topic particularly well. So use the textbooks, and in fact you can stick to the textbooks. But if you've actually found evidence in your literature review when you've been looking at other top materials on the topic, from journal articles, and you've thought about it in relation to your methodology, use that as part of your justification too. So this is my framework for writing a methodology, and there are others, so you don't have to just use this one. And I've got these 4 main sections, and then you can see I've got limitations down the side there, because what I suggest is, rather than having a section specifically on limitations, is you talk about limitations as you go along, because I generally find it's easier. So if you want to identify that there are limitations with a qualitative approach, do that in the section on research approach rather than separately. Now, a lot of students sort of say to me, well, what should I put in my introduction? You don't actually need an introduction for a methodology chapter. You can go straight into your research approach, get on with it. Tell us how this study is going to be done. So, for instance, you could almost begin with, this study was conducted using a qualitative approach and an inductive strategy, and then go on to explain and justify why they were relevant to your topic. You don't need to go around the houses and sort of say, this is a methodology chapter, it's going to tell you about my methodology, because it's just obvious from the name. You don't need to kind of say, I'll first talk about the research approach, then the research. It's just boring. Okay, so get on with it. Start with a strong statement if you can. So there might be something you want to say about your research topic. It was vital to understand motivations in a qualitative way in order to get to some depth of understanding that's been overlooked in previous studies. Really nice opening statement that sets the scene of what your methodology is all about and actually kind of makes a point. So do get on with it. And then also, there's not really any need for a conclusion. You might want to finish, because your data analysis flows nicely into your findings or results section. So what I always suggest is just make sure you end your data analysis with maybe some kind of bridging statement that takes you into your results or findings section. So maybe even sort of state something like, after you finish talking about the data analysis, the results from this analysis are now reported in chapter 4, and then people can go and look at it. So let's talk through each of these sections. So research approach, things I would expect people to cover here. Now, I don't necessarily expect people to cover research paradigm, and I think in a lot of cases it's not actually that relevant. I think particularly not that relevant in quantitative research, those students doing qualitative research only cover it if you really understand it and want to get into it, because it's usually something that many students make a bit of a mess of and actually shows lack of understanding rather than understanding. However, the other three things are areas that I would focus on. So whether it's inductive, deductive, or possibly abductive in terms of your approach, whether it's qualitative or quantitative, primary or secondary data that you're using. And I'd probably do it in that kind of order. So I tend to put inductive or deductive before whether it's qualitative or quantitative, because they don't necessarily determine which it should be. And critically explain why this approach was appropriate for your study. Then we'll look at research method. So basically this is, what method are you using to collect your data and why is this appropriate to your study? And I keep highlighting this in red because it's quite important that you explain that element. So, for example, if you're using interviews, that's your research methods, you don't want lots of text describing what an interview is. Okay, we want you to focus on why an interview is a good tool to investigate X, which is your topic. So, in that you might therefore talk about what an interview does, what it's good at, and why those good things are particularly important for your topic. But don't get into too much sort of basic description, right? So it's not just, finding stuff in a textbook about an interview and regurgitating it. You have to apply that material, and that's where you'll get your really good marks. Then there's a research design section. This is quite an important section and one which actually many students sort of skim over with hardly any detail. So I've broken this down into a number of different sections. So under 3.3, your first section might be 3.3.1, interview design. Or if you're doing questionnaires, questionnaire design. And basically here you need to explain how you've designed that research instrument, whatever it is, whether it's a questionnaire, interview schedule, an ethnography protocol, whatever it is you've done, you need to explain how it's designed. Now, things I suggest you include, don't go through every single question you've asked. You need to explain the main sections. You need to explain how these relate to your objectives. You need to explain how they might have been developed from theory. So I do a session on this in terms of actually, going through from your objectives through to designing questions. So refer back to that. And I think I do that in one of the online sessions we'll have all together. And explain things like the type of questioning strategy. So was there in your interviews, were you using narrative type approach? Were you using particular prompts? If you're doing a questionnaire, were you using a Likert scale? It's that kind of thing, and explain why you did that approach. And what you want to do is put the actual research instrument in your appendix. So that's a copy of your interview questions or a copy of your questionnaire schedule questions or your focus group protocol, whatever you put that in the appendix. And then next section in research design is sampling. So 3.3.2 might be sampling. So what sampling strategies are you using? And basically I suggest you find one that works for you. And obviously I've done some recordings on sampling, so you can go and have a look at that. And you need to explain why it's appropriate for your study and how it was implemented. And for goodness sake, if you're doing a quantitative study, make sure you talk about a quantitative sampling strategy. And if you do a qualitative study, make sure you talk about a qualitative sampling strategy. Then the next section is implementation. Now this you might find overlaps a bit with sampling. So sometimes you could wrap the two together, doesn't matter. But essentially, how did you do your interviews? Did you book a room? Did you record it? How long did it last? When did they take place? It's those sorts of details. So it's pretty factual information in this section. You don't need to reference this at all. This is just, what happened when. Similarly, interviews might have been distributed. You might have used the university JISC system to send the questionnaire online, and you might have distributed it to a network of participants through some organisation, and it's giving those kinds of details. So no need to reference things, just get on and tell people how it was implemented. And then you'll have a section on research ethics. So again, this comes under your research design. So explain any ethical issues. Bear in mind that if you're collecting data from people, there's going to be ethical issues, even if they're very minor. So you just need to get that covered. So it could be a very brief section for most of you. For a smaller number of you, it could be a more extensive section if there are ethical issues. So you just need, key things are to note that you got the ethical approval and any protocols that were put in place. And I quite like my students to actually put the participant information sheet and the participant agreement form, a blank one of those, into the appendix. Then we move on to data analysis. So obviously this is explaining how you've analysed the data. And it's just not enough to state if you're doing a quantitative study that SPSS was used. As I say there, that's like saying I wrote my dissertation using Word. SPSS is a piece of software. That's it. You need to tell us what analysis you did with that software. Jumping down to the bottom there, when I'm talking about for quantitative studies, you'd explain which descriptive and inferential statistics you use to address each objective, for instance, would be a good thing to cover there. And for a qualitative project, I would find a textbook with an approach that you understand. So something you kind of think, yeah, I've got to grips with this, and just apply it. Okay, and explain how you applied that approach. Then limitations. So as I say, I tend to weave my limitations through the methodology, and I will discuss things like limitations of qualitative research, so for the particular topic I'm looking at, qualitative research is good at certain things, but it has limitations, in terms of its representativeness, for instance. I'll explain in limitation of my sampling strategy. So maybe I haven't got a sampling frame. So if I'm doing quantitative research, it's a convenient sample. Any potential for bias. And if you're doing quantitative research, you might talk about validity and reliability. Or if you're doing qualitative study, you will talk about trustworthiness, perhaps. So that's what you might include in your methodology section. Now, I'm not talking about the conclusion here, but I just wanted to make that distinction between, in your conclusion, you might talk about limitations. You don't want to repeat what's in the methodology or cover those kind of basic things again. In the conclusion, you want to discuss other things that have emerged as you've gone along. So it might be things like the unexpected findings on something that actually you just didn't get enough data on because you weren't even expecting them to be there, so you weren't asking the question, and then that might point for areas for further research. Or possibly something that happened with the data collection. Now, in the last academic year, we had students whose data collection was affected by COVID-19, for example, and therefore they had to switch the way they did things, and that was often reported there. Okay, so go and have a listen now to the recording on writing up qualitative research if you're doing a qualitative project, or the one on writing up quantitative research if you're doing something quantitative.